Maria Santos had been a combat medic for 3 years when her unit was deployed to Iraq in 2004. At 25, she was one of the most experienced medics in her battalion, known for her quick thinking and steady hands under pressure. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she could patch up a wounded soldier in the middle of a sandstorm while being shot at, and they weren't far from wrong. The morning of October 15th started like any other inn. The air was thick with dust and tension as Maria's convoy prepared for a routine supply run to the forward operating base on the city's outskirts. Intelligence reports had been quiet for the past week, leading many to believe that insurgent activity was finally dying down in their sector. Maria checked her medical supplies one last time, ensuring she had enough morphine, bandages, and emergency blood-clotting agents for any situation they might encounter. Staff Sergeant, the convoy leader, gathered the team for their morning briefing. The route they would take had been cleared just 2 days prior by explosive ordnance disposal teams, and aerial reconnaissance showed no signs of enemy movement along their planned path. Maria's vehicle would be the third in line, carrying essential medical supplies and emergency equipment for the base clinic that had been running dangerously low on antibiotics and surgical materials. As they rolled out of the main compound, Maria felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with every mission outside the wire. She had learned to trust her instincts during her time in Iraq, and something felt different about today. The streets seemed unusually empty, even for early morning hours. Local vendors who typically set up their stalls along the main road were nowhere to be seen, and the few civilians they passed quickly ducked into buildings or side streets. The convoy moved steadily through the first checkpoint, maintaining radio contact with base operations every 15 minutes as protocol demanded. Maria monitored the radio chatter while keeping her eyes on the windows and rooftops of the buildings they passed. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot potential threats, a skill that had saved her unit multiple times during their deployment. 20 minutes into their journey, everything changed in an instant. The lead vehicle suddenly exploded in a massive fireball as an improvised explosive device detonated directly underneath it. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the 3-ton armored truck completely off the ground before slamming it back down in a twisted heap of metal. Maria's driver immediately swerved to avoid the wreckage, but the convoy had driven straight into a carefully planned ambush. Automatic weapons fire erupted from at least 6 different positions surrounding the convoy. Bullets struck their armored vehicle with metallic pings and cracks, spiderwebbing the bulletproof windows. Maria immediately grabbed her radio to call for backup while assessing the tactical situation. The convoy was trapped in a narrow street with buildings on both sides, exactly the kind of kill zone that insurgents preferred for their attacks. The second vehicle in their convoy attempted to reverse out of the ambush, but struck another hidden explosive device. Maria watched in horror as the blast threw 2 soldiers from the vehicle, their bodies landing motionless on the dusty street. Without hesitation, she grabbed her medical bag and prepared to exit her vehicle to reach the wounded soldiers, despite the intense gunfire that continued to rain down on their position. Her vehicle commander, Sergeant First Class, grabbed her arm as she reached for the door handle. He shouted over the noise of gunfire that it was too dangerous to move, that they needed to wait for the firefight to develop before attempting any rescue operations. But Maria could see that one of the fallen soldiers was still moving, weakly trying to crawl toward cover behind a concrete barrier. Against direct orders, Maria kicked open the rear door of her vehicle and sprinted across the open street toward the wounded soldier. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she ran, and she could hear her teammates shouting at her to get back to cover. The wounded soldier turned out to be Private Jackson, a 19-year-old from Tennessee who had been in country for only 2 months. He had taken shrapnel to his leg and was bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. Maria dragged Jackson behind the concrete barrier and immediately began working on his injuries. She applied pressure bandages to the worst of his wounds while using her body to shield him from the continuing gunfire. The young soldier was going into shock from blood loss, and Maria knew she had only minutes to stabilize him before his condition became critical. As she worked on Jackson's wounds, Maria became aware that the intensity of gunfire around their position was increasing. The insurgents had apparently called in reinforcements, and what had started as an ambush was developing into a full-scale firefight. She could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rifles joining the chorus of automatic weapons, indicating that the enemy was taking more carefully aimed shots at specific targets. The radio crackled with urgent communications as her unit called for immediate backup and medical evacuation. Maria learned that the lead vehicle had suffered 3 casualties, including 1 killed in action. The convoy's heavy weapons specialist was setting up a machine gun position to provide covering fire, but their ammunition supplies were limited, and they were clearly outnumbered. While treating Jackson's wounds, Maria spotted movement in a building across the street. A figure appeared briefly in a second-story window, and she caught the glint of sunlight off what appeared to be a rifle scope. She immediately pushed Jackson lower behind their concrete cover just as a sniper's bullet struck the barrier inches from where his head had been moments before. The realization that enemy snipers had them pinpointed sent a chill down Maria's spine. Their concrete barrier provided protection from ground-level fire, but they were completely exposed to shooters in elevated positions. She knew they needed to move to better cover, but Jackson was still too weak to move on his own, and carrying him across open ground would make them easy targets for any sniper watching their position. Maria made the difficult decision to leave Jackson temporarily while she attempted to reach the other wounded soldier who had been thrown from the second vehicle. Corporal Davis was lying motionless approximately 30 meters away, and Maria couldn't tell from her position whether he was still alive. She knew that every minute counted in treating trauma injuries, and that Davis might die if she didn't reach him soon. Using smoke grenades thrown by her teammates for concealment, Maria made another dangerous sprint across the street toward Davis's position. The smoke provided limited visibility, but it also meant she couldn't see where enemy fire was coming from. She relied on her memory of the street layout and the sound of gunfire to navigate through the gray haze toward where she had last seen the wounded soldier. When she reached Davis, Maria immediately checked for vital signs and found that he was still breathing but unconscious. He had sustained what appeared to be a severe head injury from the blast, along with multiple fractures and internal bleeding. His condition was far more serious than Jackson's, requiring immediate surgery that was impossible to perform in their current situation under fire. As Maria worked to stabilize Davis, she heard the distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds. The insurgents were now using indirect fire weapons, indicating that this was a much larger and more organized attack than anyone had anticipated. The first mortar round exploded approximately 50 meters from their position, showering them with debris and filling the air with acrid smoke. Her radio crackled with an urgent message from base operations. A quick reaction force was being assembled to come to their aid, but it would take at least 20 minutes for them to reach the ambush site. In the meantime, Maria and her convoy were on their own against what intelligence estimates suggested was at least 30 enemy fighters armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. The situation became even more desperate when Maria realized that their vehicle's radio had been damaged by gunfire. They were losing communication with both base operations and the incoming rescue force. Without reliable communications, the quick reaction force would have difficulty locating their exact position in the maze of similar-looking streets that made up this section of. As the firefight continued to intensify around her, Maria made the decision that would ultimately save lives but put her own in extreme danger. She would need to move to a more exposed position to signal the rescue force when they arrived, using emergency flares and hand signals to guide them to the wounded soldier's location. It was a decision that would soon test every ounce of her training, courage, and will to survive. The mortar attacks continued with increasing accuracy as the insurgents adjusted their aim based on the previous impacts. Maria realized that their current positions behind the concrete barriers would soon become untenable as the enemy gunners walked their fire closer to their location. She made the critical decision to move both wounded soldiers to a partially collapsed building approximately 40 meters to their east, which would provide better protection from both small arms fire and indirect attacks. Moving Jackson proved challenging as his leg wound had worsened during the extended firefight. The young soldier was drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss despite Maria's emergency treatment, and he was unable to support his own weight during movement. Maria fashioned a makeshift stretcher using materials from her medical pack and debris from the destroyed vehicles, knowing that dragging wounded soldiers across rough terrain could worsen their injuries. The movement to the collapsed building required 3 separate trips under heavy fire. First, Maria moved Jackson using the improvised stretcher, timing her movement to coincide with covering fire from her remaining teammates. Bullets struck the ground around them as they moved, but the suppressive fire from Sargent's position kept the enemy gunners from taking careful aim at the moving targets. Davis presented an even greater challenge due to his head injury and suspected spinal damage. Maria knew that improper movement could paralyze or kill him, but leaving him exposed to mortar fire was equally dangerous. She carefully immobilized his neck using materials from her medical kit before attempting to move him, a process that took precious minutes while enemy fire continued to rake their position. The partially collapsed building provided significantly better protection, but it also revealed the true scope of their predicament. From the elevated position in the building's second floor, Maria could see enemy fighters moving through the surrounding streets, systematically surrounding their position. She counted at least 15 different muzzle flashes from various buildings and rooftops, indicating that this was indeed a well-coordinated ambush involving a large number of insurgents. More troubling was the discovery that the building they had taken shelter in showed evidence of recent occupation by enemy forces. Maria found ammunition caches, food supplies, and communication equipment that suggested this location had been used as an insurgent staging area. The realization that they had sought shelter in an enemy position added another layer of danger to their already desperate situation. Radio communications remained sporadic due to damaged equipment and enemy jamming efforts. Maria managed to establish brief contact with the incoming quick reaction force, learning that they were still 15 minutes away and facing their own obstacles in the form of roadside bombs and small arms fire along their route. The rescue force had already lost one vehicle to an improvised explosive device and was proceeding more cautiously to avoid additional casualties. While treating the wounded soldiers in their new position, Maria discovered additional ammunition and medical supplies that had been left behind by the previous occupants. The medical supplies were mostly expired or unsuitable for trauma treatment, but she found additional morphine and antibiotics that could help keep Jackson and Davis stable until evacuation became possible. The building's strategic position also allowed Maria to observe the enemy's movements and coordinate defensive fire with her remaining teammates. She used her radio to direct Sargent's machine gun fire towards specific targets, helping to break up several attempted advances by insurgent forces. Her medical training had taught her to observe details under pressure, skills that proved valuable in identifying enemy positions and movement patterns. As the firefight entered its third hour, Maria began to notice changes in the enemy's tactics. The insurgents were no longer making direct assaults on their position, but instead appeared to be settling in for a prolonged siege. Sniper fire became more frequent and accurate, forcing Maria and her team to stay low and move only when absolutely necessary for medical treatment of the wounded. The most dangerous moment came when enemy forces attempted to use rocket-propelled grenades to destroy the building where Maria and the wounded soldiers had taken shelter. The first RPG missed its target and exploded in the street outside, but the second round struck the building's wall directly below their position. The explosion brought down part of the ceiling and filled the air with concrete dust and debris. Jackson was struck by falling concrete during the RPG attack, reopening his leg wound and causing additional injuries to his chest and arms. Maria found herself treating multiple trauma patients with limited supplies while under direct fire from enemy forces who were now attempting to storm the building. The sound of footsteps and voices in Arabic could be heard on the ground floor as insurgents began searching the building room by room. Maria made the difficult decision to move to the building's roof, carrying Davis on an improvised stretcher while Jackson attempted to climb the stairs despite his injuries. The roof provided better fields of observation for signaling the rescue force, but it also exposed them to sniper fire from surrounding buildings. She used pieces of concrete and metal debris to create defensive positions while continuing to treat the wounded soldiers. From the rooftop position, Maria could see the quick reaction force vehicles approaching through the maze of streets approximately 1 kilometer away. However, she also observed that the insurgents had positioned fighters with rocket-propelled grenades along the most direct route to their building. The rescue force was driving into another carefully planned ambush, and there was no way to warn them with their damaged radio equipment. Using emergency flares and reflective materials, Maria began signaling the approaching rescue force to alter their route. Her signals attracted immediate attention from enemy snipers, who began concentrating their fire on the rooftop position. Bullets struck the concrete around them as Maria continued her desperate attempts to redirect the rescue force away from the enemy ambush positions. The rescue force commander apparently understood Maria's signals and diverted his vehicles to an alternate route that would approach their building from the east. This route would take longer and require the rescue force to fight through additional enemy positions, but it avoided the concentrated ambush that had been prepared for them. Maria watched through binoculars as the rescue vehicles engaged enemy forces in running firefights while moving toward their position. During this period, Davis's condition deteriorated significantly. His head injury was causing increased intracranial pressure, and Maria lacked the equipment necessary to provide advanced neurosurgical care. She administered what medications she could to reduce brain swelling, but knew that Davis would require immediate surgery if he was to survive. Jackson's blood loss had also reached critical levels despite her continued efforts to control bleeding from his multiple wounds. The situation became even more desperate when Maria realized that insurgent forces had occupied the building next to their position and were preparing to attack their rooftop location directly. She could see enemy fighters moving through the adjacent building's windows, apparently preparing to jump across the narrow alley that separated the two buildings. Their elevated position, which had provided tactical advantages, was about to become a trap. With limited ammunition and medical supplies nearly exhausted, Maria prepared for what appeared to be their final stand. She positioned herself between the wounded soldiers and the most likely avenue of enemy approach, determined to protect her patients even if it meant sacrificing her own life. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, but Maria knew they were still several minutes away from being able to provide meaningful support. The enemy attack came simultaneously from three directions as insurgent forces attempted to overwhelm their rooftop position through coordinated assault. Maria returned fire with her sidearm while continuing to shield the wounded soldiers with her own body. The intensity of incoming fire was overwhelming, and she felt the impact of multiple rounds striking her body, armor, and equipment. In the chaos of the final assault, Maria was struck by enemy fire 11 times across her torso, arms, and legs. The impacts knocked her to the ground, and she felt immediate numbness spreading through her body as shock began to set in. Despite her wounds, she continued to crawl toward Jackson and Davis, determined to provide medical care even as her own condition rapidly deteriorated. As darkness began to close around her vision, Maria could hear the sound of helicopters directly overhead and the distinctive crack of sniper rifles engaging enemy positions from the air. The rescue force had finally reached their building, but she was losing consciousness from blood loss and trauma. Her last coherent thought was whether she had done enough to keep Jackson and Davis alive until help arrived. Maria's consciousness returned in brief fragments over the following 2 days. She was dimly aware of voices speaking urgently around her, the sound of helicopter rotors, and the sensation of being moved repeatedly. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, as if she was observing everything from a great distance. The 11 rounds that had struck her had caused massive trauma to multiple organ systems, and her body was fighting a desperate battle for survival. The initial rescue attempt had been only partially successful. While the quick reaction force had managed to secure Jackson and Davis, evacuating them to the combat support hospital, where both soldiers would eventually recover from their injuries, Maria's condition had been deemed too critical to move immediately. The continuing firefight around the building made helicopter evacuation impossible, and the ground route back to base remained under heavy enemy fire. Navy SEAL Team 7 had been monitoring the situation from their forward operating base 30 kilometers from. When word reached them that an American combat medic was critically wounded and trapped in enemy territory, they immediately began planning an extraction mission. The team was led by Chief Petty Officer Williams, a veteran of multiple deployments who had built a reputation for successfully completing impossible missions. The intelligence picture that the SEALs received was grim. Maria was unconscious and critically wounded in a building that remained surrounded by insurgent forces. Enemy strength in the area was estimated at over 50 fighters, armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. The building itself was partially destroyed and could collapse at any time, making helicopter extraction extremely dangerous even if the area could be secured. Chief Williams and his team spent 6 hours developing a detailed plan for the extraction mission. They would insert via helicopter at night, approximately 2 kilometers from the target building, then move on foot through enemy-controlled territory to reach Maria's location. The mission would require them to fight through multiple enemy positions while carrying specialized medical equipment to keep Maria alive during evacuation. The SEAL team departed their base at 200 hours on October 17th, 36 hours after Maria had been wounded. They carried advanced combat medical supplies, including portable blood transfusion equipment, emergency surgical instruments, and medications specifically designed for treating massive trauma in field conditions. Each team member also carried extra ammunition, expecting heavy resistance during both the approach and extraction phases of the mission. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, with the aircraft landing just long enough for the six-man SEAL team to disembark before immediately departing the area to avoid enemy fire. Chief Williams led his team through a series of abandoned buildings and rubble-filled streets, moving slowly to avoid detection by insurgent patrols that were actively searching for American forces. The team's progress was hampered by the discovery that insurgent forces had established multiple checkpoints along the most direct routes to Maria's building. The SEALs were forced to take lengthy detours through dangerous terrain, including areas that had not been cleared of improvised explosive devices. Their movement was further complicated by the need to avoid civilian areas where their presence might endanger non-combatants. After 4 hours of careful movement through enemy territory, the SEAL team reached a position approximately 200 meters from the building where Maria remained trapped. From their concealed observation post, they could see that insurgent forces had indeed surrounded the structure and were maintaining constant surveillance of all approaches. Enemy fighters had established fighting positions in adjacent buildings and were clearly prepared for another rescue attempt. Chief Williams used advanced optical equipment to observe the target building and identify the most likely location where Maria might be positioned. Thermal imaging revealed a single heat signature on the building's second floor that appeared to be stationary, suggesting that this was their target. However, the building showed extensive damage from the previous day's fighting, with large sections of walls and ceiling having collapsed. The extraction plan called for a coordinated assault on enemy positions surrounding the building, followed by rapid insertion of the medical team to stabilize Maria for transport. The team would then fight their way to a predetermined extraction point where helicopters would be standing by to evacuate both the wounded soldier and the SEAL team. The entire operation would need to be completed before dawn to maintain the advantage of darkness. The assault began with precision sniper fire from the team's designated marksmen, who systematically eliminated enemy sentries and machine gun positions that posed the greatest threat to the approaching team members. Simultaneously, other team members engaged insurgent forces with automatic weapons and grenades, creating confusion and drawing enemy fire away from the building where Maria was located. The diversionary attack worked exactly as planned, with insurgent forces rushing to reinforce their positions against what they perceived as a major assault. This allowed Chief Williams and the team's combat medic to approach Maria's building undetected, while the remainder of the team maintained pressure on enemy forces throughout the surrounding area. When the two SEALs reached the building's second floor, they found Maria barely alive but still breathing. She had been unconscious for over 40 hours, surviving on rainwater that had collected in debris around her position and the strength of her will to live. Her wounds had been partially treated using medical supplies that she had applied to herself before losing consciousness, demonstrating remarkable presence of mind even while critically injured. The team's combat medic immediately began advanced trauma treatment, establishing intravenous fluid replacement and administering medications to stabilize Maria's blood pressure and heart rate. Her condition was even more serious than they had anticipated, with evidence of internal bleeding, possible spinal injuries, and infections setting in around several of her bullet wounds. The medic estimated that she had only hours to live without immediate surgical intervention. Chief Williams coordinated the extraction while his medic worked to stabilize Maria for transport. The remaining team members continued their diversionary attacks, but ammunition was running low, and enemy forces were beginning to regroup for a counterattack. Radio communications with the extraction helicopters indicated that the aircraft were standing by but would need at least 10 minutes of clear airspace to safely land and take off with casualties. Moving Maria from the building proved to be the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Her injuries made it impossible to move her quickly, requiring careful handling to prevent further damage to her spine and internal organs. The makeshift stretcher that the SEALs had brought was designed for rapid evacuation, but Maria's condition demanded slow, careful movement that would expose the team to enemy fire for extended periods. The team's movement toward the extraction point was complicated by renewed insurgent attacks, as enemy forces realized that Americans were attempting another rescue operation. Rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire forced the SEALs to take cover repeatedly, making their progress toward the landing zone agonizingly slow, while Maria's condition continued to deteriorate. During the movement to the extraction point, Maria briefly regained consciousness for the first time in 2 days. Despite her critical condition and the chaos of battle around them, she attempted to provide medical guidance to help the SEAL team's medic treat her wounds more effectively. Her professional instincts as a combat medic remained sharp, even though her body was failing from massive trauma and blood loss. The extraction helicopters arrived at the predetermined landing zone despite heavy enemy fire, with door gunners providing suppressive fire against insurgent positions. The helicopter crews had volunteered for this mission, knowing that it would require them to land in an active combat zone and remain on the ground long enough to load a critical casualty who required careful handling. Loading Maria onto the helicopter required all 6 SEAL team members working together while under direct fire from enemy forces who had repositioned to attack the landing zone. Bullets struck the aircraft's armor plating as the crew chief and team medic secured Maria to the helicopter's medical equipment. The pilots maintained power to the rotors throughout the loading process, ready to take off immediately once all personnel were aboard. The flight to the combat support hospital took 18 minutes, during which the helicopter's flight medic and the SEAL team's combat medic worked together to keep Maria alive. Her blood pressure dropped twice during the flight, requiring immediate intervention with fluids and medications. Radio communications with the receiving hospital allowed the flight crew to prepare the surgical team for Maria's arrival and the extensive operations that would be required to save her life. Maria arrived at the hospital with no measurable blood pressure and barely detectable vital signs. The surgical team, led by Colonel Jennifer Martinez, had been standing by for over an hour and immediately took her into the operating room for emergency surgery. The operations would continue for the next 14 hours as surgeons worked to repair damage to her liver, kidneys, and intestines, while also addressing the 11 bullet wounds that had nearly killed her. 3 days after the surgery, Maria regained consciousness in the hospital's intensive care unit. Her first words were questions about Jackson and Davis, the 2 soldiers she had risked her life to save during the ambush. When she learned that both men had survived and were recovering from their injuries, Maria smiled for the first time since arriving at the hospital. The nurses noted that her vital signs immediately improved upon receiving this news. The SEAL team that had rescued Maria visited her in the hospital before returning to their base. Chief Williams presented her with the team's challenge coin and told her that she had displayed courage equal to any special operations soldier he had ever served with. The recognition meant more to Maria than any official award she would later receive for her actions during the ambush and her survival against impossible odds. 6 months later, Maria returned to duty as a combat medic after extensive rehabilitation and additional medical training. She specifically requested assignment to another combat zone, stating that her experience had reinforced her commitment to serving alongside soldiers in dangerous situations. Her story became legendary within the medical corps, inspiring a new generation of combat medics to serve with courage and dedication, regardless of personal risk. The building where Maria had survived for 2 days was later destroyed in subsequent military operations, but the site became known among American forces as Santos Point, in recognition of her extraordinary survival and the sacrifice of all who had served there. For Maria, the true measure of success was not her own survival, but the knowledge that her actions had saved the lives of fellow soldiers who trusted her with their care.